Hey guys, Waterfowler41 here, and in today's video we are kicking off a three-part series that I'll collectively call my Rebels Corsa conversion. So in video 1 here, we're going to be looking at the Corsa cold air intake, and we'll be installing this on my 2020 Ram Rebel. So this is part number 465576-1. This fits the newer 2019 and newer Ram pickup trucks with the 5.7, and it also fits the e-torque series. So I know a lot of times when people are looking at air intakes, they're not quite sure whether the intake will clear the motor on the side of the e-torques. This kit definitely will. So let's dive into what we get in the kit, and then we can quickly run through the installation. This is a very easy install. This will drop right in place of the factory intake, so I don't imagine running into too many hiccups here. So let's take a look at what comes in the kit, what tools we need, and then we can start looking at the lay of the land as far as what needs to come out for this guy to go in. So in the kit, you get a couple things. You got two different options actually when you order it. So you could either get the dry filter like I did, or you can get the oiled filter, which is basically the conventional one. The difference between the two is this filter doesn't require any sort of oil to maintain its filtration rating, whereas the oil filter or oiled filter requires the application of air filter oil when you're using it on your truck. So basically what you could do with those is you can clean them and then you can re-oil them and pop them right back in. Whereas the PowerCore filter in this kit is dry. It's basically a large paper element, and it gives us the filtration that we need, and it's massive. So this is my first time using a dry filter. It's also my first time using a filter that fits inside of a box. I'm used to the open element air intakes, so I'm curious how this one's going to sound on the truck. I went ahead and took sound readings of the truck in factory form. I even recorded the decibel reading of the factory truck just to see what the sound difference happens with this kit. So back to what we get in the kit itself. So this will replace everything from the filter to the intake tube all the way into the throttle body. So the throttle body will feed right into the intake tube here. There's a location for your factory mass airflow sensor as well as your PCV hose. You get the couplings that you need to attach it, get the box as well as all the hardware to make everything look nice and pretty. So as far as installation and tools, this is, like I said, this is a super easy one. You can knock this out in about a half hour. Grab yourself a Phillips head and a flathead as well as an 8mm wrench, and that is really all you need in order to get the factory intake out and the new intake in. So let's take a look at the intake on the truck now. So here is the factory air intake. You got the hose going into the air filter box. So we're going to be removing the sensor. So there's that air intake temperature sensor right back there. We're going to be removing the plug on that, as well as this PCV hose, which basically just clicks right off of the fitting on there. Then we'll go ahead and remove this clamp as well as the clamp on the throttle body, and we'll be able to pull that intake tube out. Then we'll move over here and we'll open up this box, or basically leave the box as one piece, and essentially what we can do is grab it from the front and from the sides and just pull it straight up. It's super easy to do. I will walk through it step by step. So let's go ahead and start with removing the sensors and everything on here and get everything rocking and rolling. So let me get a ladder so I can reach in there since I'm just a bit short. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is pull the hose off of the PCV valve. So that's just a little retainer clip that you push in, and then it slides right off of the little joint here. Then the next thing we're going to do is unplug our air temperature sensor. So at this point, everything is free with the exception of the hose clamps. So we're going to use an 8mm socket to loosen up these guys, and then this should pull right off. That's loose. And be careful when removing this because you want to keep that sensor intact because you're going to be reusing that air temperature sensor. So now that the hose is off, set that aside. And then we will remove this intake box. So this is pretty simple. Basically just grab it like so, get a good hand on it, and then you just pull it straight up. So. And it just pops out like that. So basically the only thing holding it in is these little rubber clips here, as well as on the bottom. So now we are good to go to start installing the Corsa air intake kit. So we could leave this all as one assembly. It's a gigantic box. So I'll leave this in one gigantic assembly, and I'll just toss this in the Corsa box, and we'll get that Corsa intake ready to go. We'll prep that, and then we'll get it ready to drop right in here. Okay, so now that we have the factory intake tube out, and here's just kind of a side-by-side, so look, it just drops right in place of the Corsa one will drop right in place of the factory one. So this is a straight intake tube. It's also plastics too, which is kind of worth noting, because the metal intake tubes that come in some air intake kits, they actually end up holding heat worse than plastic. And what ends up happening is you take your cold air intake and you're basically turning it into a hot air intake, because it's going to use that hose as a heat exchanger. So plastic, it dissipates the heat much better than a metal intake tube will. Now the other thing you're going to notice is you don't have these bellows in the Corsa kit, and what, in my opinion, I don't have any scientific proof behind this, but in my opinion, what that's going to result in is a little bit more noise coming out of the intake, which is kind of what I want. I want that cool factor. I want to be able to hit the gas and hear that intake come to life. So next thing we're going to do is remove the air intake temperature sensor. So if you notice the orientation, the clip of it is facing towards the outside of the elbow. So we're going to make sure that when we reinstall here, same way, it's pointing that way. Okay, I want to make sure I cover this kind of closely here. So here's the air intake temperature sensor, and what you notice on the inside of it is there's a little tongue here, right about there. And you want to make sure that that little tongue gets up over this ridge. So if you take the air intake temperature sensor, torque a little bit, then it gives you enough to clear that, and you can carefully remove this guy, and that's your temperature sensor right there. So when we are installing it into the Corsa intake, we want to make sure that this little loop, that little blue tip there, is oriented in the flow of the air. So we're going to basically muscle that guy in here, and we're going to get it so when the air is passing through here, it's actually passing through the sensor. Since it's a tight fit, I'm going to take my time here and go ahead and pop that in there. Might use some soapy water just to help slide things in nicely, and then we'll get back. Okay, so we have the intake temperature sensor correctly installed, so we want to make sure that the clip is facing the outside of the elbow, which results in the intake hoop being somewhat in the airflow direction coming this way. So when the air is coming in, it's going to cross right through that hoop inside the temperature sensor, and you're going to get an accurate reading. So the next thing we're going to do is go ahead and loosely install these guys, these little couplings, on the intake tube itself, and then we're going to set this aside and we'll start working on the intake box, because we got to get this big filter dropped in there and bolted in, and then at that point we're good to go to drop it into the truck. So let's go ahead, get these couplings on here. This one's got kind of a weird angle to it, so I'm not quite sure the exact orientation, so we might leave this one off until we drop it in the truck just to figure out which orientation it needs on it. But let's go ahead and at least get this guy on here, and then we could start messing around with the box. All right, now that we got the intake tube all set up, ready to go, next thing we're going to focus in on is the intake box here. So basically, the filter is going to drop in there. There is a filter adapter. I went ahead and slipped that on there. There's a gigantic band clamp that you just tighten down to make sure that that's cinched down. And what you'll see here is 2 threaded inserts on the filter adapter. So what we're going to do is we're going to drop that into the intake box, and those threaded inserts will line up with these holes. And then you're going to use the supply hardware, which is 8mm nut or 8mm bolt and washer, to basically hold that filter up against this wall. Then at that point we can go ahead and close it back up and reinstall this guy, which that's a nice little cover there for the top. And then we are ready to drop this into the truck. So then as far as dropping in the truck, we'll do the filter box first, and then we will connect everything with the intake tube, and then we are done. Super simple installation. So let's go ahead and get this guy dropped into the intake box, lined up with these holes, and tightened down. Again, you don't need to go crazy with tightening this down. It's still just plastic, and these are inserts. You can pull them out if you over tighten it. You don't need them crazy Hulk tight, because ultimately you just want that intake to be held in there pretty firmly in the box. What's going to hold it and make sure it's airtight is that connection between this coupling and the end of the intake tube. So let's go ahead and get it dropped in here and get everything ready to go into the truck. Okay, so we have the air intake filter installed into the box. So just kind of a hint, a lot of times these intakes are pretty bulky, and even if it was an open element, usually there is a box of some sort, and it takes a certain angle to get that filter dropped in there. This one certainly does qualify as one of those where you got to get that filter at the right angle just to drop it in. So basically, this is the top of the filter. This is the outlet portion of it. So inlet, outlet. drop the filter in like this, and then basically feed it into the hole, and then it'll pop in. That'll give it enough room to clear the edge here because the filter is pretty lengthy. All right, so the next thing we're gonna do is we got our plexiglass cover. We're gonna take that guy, pop it on like that, and then we will tighten everything down with those Phillips head screwdrivers and get this guy popped into the truck. So looks pretty sweet, pretty dark. So this must be like a tinted plexiglass. Can't really see the Corsa too well, but I have some ideas as far as throwing an LED in there to really light up everything. But we'll tackle that further down the road. So let's go ahead and get those Phillips head screwdrivers. So there's 4 of them popped in here, and then we can get this guy tossed into the truck. And like I was saying, with the intake, this is the little spout here, and we got the room here. This is what it's going to connect up to. So this is the factory hose that goes into the grill. So with that Corsa intake, it's going to drop down right on these little mounting pegs, and then we're good. So let's go ahead and get everything ready to go. All right, so we are going to drop the air intake in. Like I said, you just line it up with those 4 posts, and that's it. So you can see right down here, it lines up nicely with the factory intake hose, and everything's in place. So let's go ahead and connect the intake tube to the throttle body, and then we'll be cooking with fire here. All right, so now we got the intake tube ready to go. We're gonna just drop that guy right there, and then just let's do this guy first, I guess. There we go. So now I'm going to spend the next couple minutes just making sure everything is situated properly before I fully tighten it down. And if you're anything like me with air intake kits, and just when you use a lot of hose clamps like this, you kind of want them all to line up. Just looks nicer. It'll complement how nice this air intake looks. So I'm going to spend the next couple minutes just making sure that the couplings or the rubber couplers here are properly tightened down, and all the pipe clamps are in order. All right, so the intake tube is down, it is tight. So now the last thing we got to do is take the PCV valve and click this guy up into place. All right, there we go. Take the temperature sensor, and this guy drops in right there, and we are good to go. So there is the Corsa intake installation. Took all of about 30 minutes. I think what I spent the most time doing is making sure my clamps were equally spaced and facing the same direction. Other than that, everything drops right in. Super simple installation. Really the only thing that I could see as being a hiccup for anyone is just trying to figure out how to remove that factory intake. But again, the trick there is just to pull it straight up. You're gonna feel like you're gonna break it, but again, just give it a nice firm tug and it'll pop right out. Then as far as installation, once you get that filter installed in the box, you drop the box down in there, and then you get your intake tube and get that all lined up. As far as this offset coupler, it's straight on the outside, and then it's offset on the inside. So it's offset on the passenger side in case you're looking for how that lines up. But let me go ahead and make sure everything is tightened down, and then we'll go ahead and fire this guy up and hear what it sounds like. So just for record, the factory intake was 103 decibels, and that was with the decibel meter right here. That's not scientific by any means, but that's just kind of a frame of reference, and we'll see how loud this guy is. I don't know if it'll be as loud as your typical open intake air filters because you got this box here, and that's going to absorb some sound. But I certainly think this is going to increase the sound a little bit, at least change the tone a little bit. So let's go ahead and double check everything, and then we'll fire it up. All right, so we are completely installed, everything's cinched down, and I just did my first little sound verification using my new decibel meter. I know, we're getting pretty official here. So the factory intake was 103 decibels, and that was basically with the decibel meter sitting right here. Again, not scientific by any means, but as far as consistency, that's exactly where the decibel meter sat for the Corsa air intake. And turns out, and I revved up to the same RPM, so let me note that. So I went up to 4,000 RPMs on each rev just to make sure I could stay as consistent as possible. So the Corsa intake went up 2 decibels. Now, do I really think I'll be able to tell the difference on 2 decibels? I don't think so, but I could certainly tell that there's a little bit different of a sucking noise on the intake. So I'm excited to get this bad boy out on the road and drive it around for a couple 100 miles before I give you kind of my last thoughts on the intake. So let's go ahead and close everything up, take a little test drive, make sure everything is functioning perfectly fine, and then I will get back in a couple of days with my final thoughts on this intake. But again, from an aesthetics perspective, from a pop the hood and here's what you see perspective, intake pops. It is awesome. This is probably one of the most solid intakes I've ever installed on a truck. Like I said, I've used several in the past. This is the second one on this truck alone. But this is my first time using the box style intake that uses the factory, I guess, snorkel that goes to the grill. So everything is cinched down and there is no movement whatsoever, unlike other intakes that I've seen. So let's go ahead and drive around for a couple 100 miles and I'll get back with kind of final thoughts on it. But again, from a looks, from a sound perspective, I think everything's kind of knocking it out of the park. So let's go take a test drive. All right, so I've had the opportunity to drive about 100 miles with the truck, so I guess I'll give you some feedback on the intake. So performed very well, looks awesome underneath the truck. But with air intakes, particularly on these modern vehicles, you really got to kind of align your expectations. Going into this, I was looking for really 3 things to improve. One, you pop the hood, you want something to pop. With the intake, it certainly sticks out, and it's a very cool feature underneath the hood. The second thing is I was definitely looking for the sound improvement. So with the stock intake, they're designed in such a way to really quiet down the truck as much as possible. These cold air intakes, or really any sort of aftermarket intake, is certainly going to improve or at least increase the sound. And depending on who you are, that might be an improvement. In my case, I was certainly looking for that improvement in sound, and I got it. When you hammer the gas on the truck above 3,500 RPMs, the thing screams. So with intakes, especially tube intakes like this, the impact on sound, it basically gives your truck a throatier sound. So with this truck, like I said, above 3,500 RPMs, when you're really hammering on it, you could really hear that intake come to life, and you could hear the sound coming from the front passenger side of the truck. So again, in my application or in my situation, I really wanted to hear that sound. I'm a gearhead at heart. I like to make the truck louder. That certainly did it. It's not obnoxiously loud, but it certainly gives it a throatier, more muscular noise when you hit that gas pedal down to the floor. As far as performance, this is where you really need to make sure you align your expectations. When you install something like this, regardless of the brand, it's not going to give you 15, 30, 100 horsepower right off the bat. So with intakes especially, and especially on fuel-injected vehicles where the computer is really controlling what everything does and how everything responds, intakes like this come to life after you've tuned the engine or tuned the ECM to account for that extra air. So just throwing it on as a bolt-on, sure, you're going to get a little improvement. Maybe the butt dyno tells you a little bit different, that maybe you get a little bit more response in the throttle, and I think I do. But intakes, cold air intakes, really anything in general like that, they come to life when you take the next step and get the engine tuned. So I have full intention, once this truck rolls out of warranty, to get the tune. The cold air intake is a good preparatory step for when the tune is on the list for my truck. So again, 3 things that this intake does to the truck. 1, pop the hood, it looks awesome. And I guess 4 things, because I really like to tinker with my truck, and this gave me an opportunity to mess around with something on my truck and install something pretty sweet. 3rd thing, I guess, is the sound. It certainly improves the sound, gives it a throatier, more intake suck, I guess, when you hit the gas. So you certainly hear it, and when it's coupled up with an exhaust system, you really do hear that throatier noise make it through the engine. And then the 4th thing, performance-wise, again, align your expectations with this one. There might be some minor improvements with the intake in factory form, but again, these things really do come to life when you start having either a can tune or a custom tune developed for your truck, where you can make sure that the mapping and really the ECM is set up to accommodate or to account for that air intake. Anyways, installation was super easy. That dropped in right in place, not a single issue. I think it took longer, like I said, for me to basically line up the band clamps and making sure that those were nice and organized. The sound is awesome. This thing looks great. And ultimately, at the end of the day, once I pull the trigger on a tune, or once I roll out a warranty and get that tune set up, this thing is really going to help bring the the additional ponies out of the engine. Other than that, that is the installation of the Corsa air intake. Thank you very much for watching. Appreciate it.